the first mourner left before anyone had touched the coffee. He was Edwin Marr, a retired freight clerk with a white mustache and a habit of standing through funerals because arthritis made pews unbearable. At 7 on the evening of October 17, 1969, Edwin walked out of the receiving house at Old Sentinel Cemetery without his hat, crossed the wet grass in a straight line, and climbed over the locked iron gate, as if the road beyond it were on fire. His wife called after him. He did not turn. By the time 2 men reached the gate, Edwin was already halfway down Gear Street, running with both hands pressed over his ears. Inside the receiving house, the dead woman lay beneath a gauze veil in a walnut coffin that had not been opened. Her name was Viola March. She had taught penmanship at Galena's public school for 34 years, buried 2 husbands, and outlived every sibling. She had died at 71 in the upstairs bedroom of her brick house on Bench Street. The physician had written pulmonary failure. The undertaker had prepared her without difficulty. Nothing about her death required secrecy, haste, or fear. Nothing except her final request. Viola had left a sealed instruction in the custody of her attorney. She wished to be waked for one night in the old cemetery receiving house, the limestone building near the eastern wall that had been closed since 1911. She wished no church service before burial. She wished the coffin to remain shut until midnight. She wished every person who had received a black-bordered invitation to attend, and she had written that no invitation was to be declined on account of weather, illness, distance, or resentment. The attorney, Julian Vale, had read the request twice and then placed it face down on his desk. Old Sentinel Cemetery had forbidden wakes on its grounds for nearly 60 years. The rule was older than most living members of the cemetery board, and stranger than any regulation printed in its bylaws. No overnight vigils, no candles after sunset, no coffin to remain above ground past 10 o'clock, no food, drink, hymn, prayer circle, or family gathering inside the receiving house. The building could be opened only for maintenance and only in daylight, with both doors propped wide. When Viola's executor presented her instructions, the board refused. Julian threatened court action. Viola had donated land to the city library, money to the county hospital, and a row of commercial buildings whose rents supported 3 charities. Her will tied those bequests to compliance with her burial wishes. By noon, the mayor had intervened. By 4, the cemetery board had issued a one-night exception. At 6:30, 43 mourners entered the receiving house. At 7, Edwin Marr fled. The second mourner was his wife. She had been standing beside a table of sandwiches when she stiffened, lowered her cup, and whispered, "That is not the room we came into." No one understood her. The receiving house was rectangular, with a high timber roof, 2 narrow windows, and limestone walls dampened by generations of river fog. Folding chairs occupied the center. Viola's coffin rested on a low bier at the north end, beneath a black cloth canopy borrowed from Harker Funeral Home. 2 electric floor lamps gave the stone a yellow cast. A coffee urn hissed beside the west wall. The double doors stood closed against the rain. Mrs. Marr looked toward the coffin, then toward the doors, then at the wall behind her. "There used to be another door," she said. Julian Vale took her arm. "Clara, you have not been in this building before." She looked at him with exhausted certainty. "Yes, I have." Then she slapped his hand away, pushed through the mourners, and followed her husband into the rain. After that, people began leaving in pairs. Not all of them ran. Some walked with rigid calm. Some apologized. One woman vomited beside an angel monument and would not explain why. A hardware merchant named Paul Dre came out laughing in short, breathless bursts, then sat in his Buick and drove away with the passenger door open. 2 sisters from Dubuque abandoned their coats on the chairbacks. A county nurse crossed herself despite being Lutheran and said the dead woman had spoken through her closed mouth. By 7:30, 14 mourners had gone. By 8, 26. The rain strengthened over Galena, sliding down the steep streets and turning the old cemetery paths black. Headlights moved along the hills below, shrinking through bare branches. The town's brick buildings glistened under street lamps, their upper windows reflecting a sky the color of iron filings. Inside the receiving house, the remaining mourners drew away from one another. Among them was Lydia Keene, a 29-year-old school secretary who had cared for Viola during the last 6 months of her illness. Lydia had no family in Galena. She had arrived from Rockford 4 years earlier, taken a room above a dress shop, and learned the town by the sound of its stairways and the names printed on school forms. Viola had first noticed her because Lydia corrected a filing mistake no one else had seen. Their friendship developed without warmth at first. Viola disliked sentiment. Lydia distrusted generosity. By the following winter, they were eating Sunday supper together. Viola had left Lydia a brass key and one sentence in a sealed envelope. "Stay until she is seen." Lydia had read the message that afternoon and assumed it meant she was to ensure the coffin was opened before burial. Now, watching the mourners retreat from the bier, she understood that Viola had chosen the words "seen with care." Beside her stood Noah Bell, the assistant undertaker from Harker's, a quiet man in his early 40s with a burned scar across the back of his right hand. He had supervised the transport of the coffin and objected to every irregularity. He objected to the cemetery wake, to the sealed coffin, to the use of the abandoned receiving house, and especially to the demand that the body remain unattended by funeral staff after midnight. His employer had ignored him. "People are frightening one another," Noah said. Lydia kept her eyes on the coffin. "Did Mrs. March speak at the funeral home?" "No." "Did anything happen there?" "No." "You answered too quickly." Noah flexed his scarred hand. "A body makes noises. Air shifts. The throat releases. Wood settles. People who do not work around the dead give meaning to ordinary things." "What happened?" He looked toward Julian Vale, who was speaking with the mayor near the doors. "The inside of the coffin lid was wet," Noah said. "Not damp. Wet enough to drip. We changed the lining twice." "From what?" "There was no leak." "Was the body wet?" "No." Before Lydia could answer, the coffin gave a small, deliberate knock. Conversation stopped. It was not the sound of wood settling. It came once from beneath the lid near Viola's head. Noah moved first. He crossed the room, put his palm on the walnut, and leaned close. Another knock sounded, this time from the foot. The mourners nearest the bier stepped back. Mayor Calvin Sloan raised both hands. He was a heavy man with silver hair and a careful public voice. "This is precisely how panic begins. The coffin was brought in from the cold. The wood is adjusting." Noah did not remove his hand. A third knock came from the center. Then a woman near the coffee urn screamed. On the west wall, where moisture had darkened the limestone, a rectangle was appearing. The lines emerged slowly, 4 straight seams in the stone, tall and narrow as a door. Within them, beads of water formed the shape of a handle. Mrs. Marr had been right. There had been another door. The mayor ordered everyone outside. No one obeyed at first. They watched the wet outline deepen. A smell entered the room, not decay, but boiled linen and old face powder. Lydia recognized it from Viola's bedroom during her final weeks. Underneath it was another odor, mineral and sour, like a cellar after floodwater had gone down. The rectangle trembled. A voice came from behind the wall. It said, very softly, "Do not let them count you." 3 more mourners fled. The mayor pushed open the double doors. Rain blew into the room. "The wake is over." Julian Vale stepped in front of him. The terms of the will require. I do not care what the terms require. You will care when the hospital loses its endowment. Calvin's face tightened. For a moment, Lydia saw not an official, but a frightened boy hiding anger behind posture. No one was meant to be in this building after dark, he said. The room heard him. Noah turned from the coffin. You knew the rule had a reason. I knew there was a rule. That is not what you said. Calvin looked at the wet door taking shape in the wall, and his expression answered before he did. The remaining mourners began to shout at him. Some demanded the coffin be removed. Others insisted the lid be opened. Reverend Alden Pike, the Episcopal rector who had agreed to say a brief prayer despite Viola's instructions, called for order and received none. The coffee urn toppled. Hot liquid spread across the stone floor, but instead of running toward the doors, it moved in a narrow stream toward the sealed coffin. Lydia watched it reach the bier. The stream divided into 5 branches and stopped beneath the 5 brass feet. The coffin knocked again, 5 times. Noah seized the handles. "Help me move her." 2 men joined him. They lifted. The coffin did not rise. They strained until the bier creaked, but the walnut box seemed fastened to the room. Noah crouched, checked beneath it, and found no bolts, hooks, or straps. He tried again. The coffin remained immovable while the lightweight bier shuddered beneath it. One of the men released his grip. "She's holding herself here." The sentence emptied the room more effectively than the mayor's command. People rushed through the double doors. Chairs overturned. Coats fell. A tray of sandwiches struck the floor. Within a minute, only 7 living people remained inside. Lydia, Noah, Julian, Reverend Pike, Mayor Sloan, the cemetery superintendent Ruth Calder, and Viola's nephew, Benjamin March. Benjamin had arrived late and drunk. He was 56, thick-necked and red-eyed, with the ruined elegance of a man who had spent years expecting an inheritance. Viola had left him nothing except an invitation to the wake. He had not spoken to her for 11 years. Now he stood at the foot of the coffin and smiled. "She got what she wanted," he said. "A room full of people terrified to leave her alone." Lydia disliked him immediately, though Viola had once warned her not to confuse dislike with understanding. "What did she want?" Lydia asked. Benjamin rubbed his mouth. "To make us remember." "Remember what?" His smile vanished. From behind the wet outline in the wall came the sound of fingernails dragging down stone. Ruth Calder backed away. She had managed Old Sentinel for 22 years and knew every section, path, retaining wall, and family plot. She was a broad-shouldered woman who kept a ring of keys at her belt and did not tolerate superstition among her workers, yet she now stared at the sealed door with tears standing in her eyes. "My grandfather bricked that opening," she said. Calvin Sloan spoke sharply. "Ruth." "No, I am done obeying dead men." She looked at Lydia. "There was a preparation room behind that wall, not for embalming, for watching." Reverend Pike frowned. "Watching what?" "The mourners." The scratching stopped. Then came a child's cough. It sounded from the coffin. Benjamin staggered backward and struck a chair. Lydia turned to him. "Who is in there?" "My aunt." "That was not an old woman." Benjamin's face had gone gray. Noah reached for the coffin lid, but the brass keyholes had been filled with black sealing wax. He took a pocket knife from his vest and began cutting the wax away. Calvin caught his wrist. "You will not open it before midnight." Noah stared at him. That was Viola's instruction. "It is also the only part of this we should not violate." "Why?" The mayor's hand shook around Noah's wrist. "Because the last time that coffin was opened during a wake," he said, "the mourners did not all leave alive. Rain beat against the narrow windows. No one moved. Julian Vale closed the double doors again, shutting out the wind. "Tell us." Calvin looked at the room, as though judging whether silence could still protect him. Ruth answered instead. In 1911, influenza went through the North End, before anyone called it influenza. Families brought their dead here because the undertakers were full. The receiving house became a place for wakes, 5, 6 coffins at a time. People sat through the night because they were afraid of burying someone who might still breathe. "That happened everywhere," Reverend Pike said. "Not like this." Ruth touched the keys at her belt. The cemetery board hired a woman named Inez Warrow to keep account. She was not a nurse, but she had worked in a mining camp infirmary. She checked pulses, held mirrors under noses, watched the coffins. The town trusted her because she found 2 people alive after doctors had pronounced them dead. Noah glanced at Viola's coffin. What changed? The board began charging families for a second examination. Poor families could not pay. Inez refused to separate the dead by money. She checked everyone. Calvin said, "This is not the place." "It is exactly the place," Ruth continued. "The cemetery trustees ordered her to stop. She kept doing it. Then one night, a child woke in the back room after his coffin had been nailed shut. His family had not paid. Inez opened it anyway." The child coughed again from inside Viola's coffin. Benjamin made a sound like a sob. Lydia's envelope seemed to burn in her pocket. "Stay until she is seen." "What was the child's name?" she asked. Ruth looked at Benjamin. He closed his eyes. "Ephraim March," he said. "My father." The wet outline in the wall darkened. Benjamin sank into a chair. He was 8 years old. He told me once, when he was dying. He remembered waking in a narrow box and hearing people pray in the next room. He scratched until his nails came off. Inez Warrow heard him. She broke the lid. He lived another 63 years. "And Viola knew," Lydia said. "She was there. She was 13. Noah removed the last of the wax from one keyhole. "Then why was the building closed?" Benjamin stared at the floor. "Because another coffin moved that night." The room cooled so quickly that their breath appeared. Ruth took a hurricane lantern from a shelf and lit it. The electric lamps had begun to dim, their filaments sinking to orange. She unlocked a metal cabinet near the east wall. Inside were rolled cemetery plans, rusted tools, and a narrow wooden box. She carried the box to the table. Within it lay 43 black cloth tokens, each the size of a postage stamp. Some bore stitched initials. Others were blank. They smelled faintly of camphor. Ruth said, "My grandfather called them attendance marks." Julian picked one up. "For what?" "For deciding who had stayed long enough to witness a death." Noah looked at the abandoned chairs. "There were 43 invitations tonight." No one answered. Lydia counted the tokens. 43. Reverend Pike crossed himself. Ruth unrolled an old plan. It showed the receiving house with a narrow chamber behind the west wall. Inside that chamber, drawn in pencil, were 5 parallel shelves and a square marked "Viewing Grill." "The trustees watched from there," Ruth said. "Not the dead, the families. They wanted to know who challenged the burial fees, who accused the cemetery doctor, who threatened to go to the newspaper. At every wake, Inez gave each mourner a black token. Those who stayed beside a coffin until dawn could testify that the person had shown no sign of life. Those who left could be dismissed as unreliable." Julian's mouth tightened. "A system for manufacturing witnesses. A system for manufacturing silence." The lights went out. The hurricane lantern remained. In its weak glow, every abandoned chair was occupied. Not by bodies, by impressions. The seats sagged. Chair backs creaked. Wet footprints appeared beneath invisible shoes. 43 places filled one after another while the 7 living people stood motionless among them. Then the coffin lid exhaled. A long white breath seeped from the seam. It crossed the room at knee height, smelling of starch, damp hair, and old fever. As it touched each invisible chair, a figure took shape for an instant. A woman with a handkerchief over her mouth, a miner with black crescents beneath his nails, a girl holding a baby, an old man whose face had been bound in cloth. They were not the mourners who had fled. They were earlier mourners. Each looked toward the sealed room in the wall, and each whispered the same sentence. We stayed. They counted us gone. The figures vanished. The 7 living heard footsteps outside, circling the building. Too many footsteps for the people who had fled. They passed the narrow windows in slow procession, but no face appeared against the glass. Calvin Sloan went to the doors. Noah blocked him. You said the last mourners did not all leave alive. Calvin's composure broke. My grandfather was cemetery treasurer. He kept the board minutes. I found them when I was 19. What happened after Ephraim woke? There were 5 coffins in this building. Inez opened the boys. The mourners panicked and demanded the others be checked. The trustees refused. They said the boy had been an error, not proof of anything. Were the others alive? One was. The scratching behind the wall resumed. Calvin stared at the coffin. A woman named Adelaide Voss, 26 years old. She had collapsed after childbirth. The cemetery physician declared her dead. Her husband had no money for the second examination. Inez heard movement. The trustees ordered everyone out before she could open the coffin. Ruth said, they drove the mourners out. Most went. Some stayed. How many? Calvin looked at the 43 tokens. 43. The number settled over the room. Lydia understood why Viola had invited exactly 43 people. What did the trustees do to those who stayed? She asked. Calvin did not answer. Benjamin did. They locked the outer doors. Reverend Pike whispered. With the mourners inside? The trustees entered through the back room. They offered each person money to sign a statement saying no sound had come from Adelaide's coffin. Some signed. Some refused. They kept them here until morning. And Adelaide? Benjamin's eyes moved to the wet wall. They put her coffin in the watching room so the sound would be farther away. The dragging nails became frantic. Noah seized a crowbar from Ruth's cabinet and drove it into the wet seam. The stone resisted. He struck again. From within Viola's coffin, the child began to cough violently. Benjamin clutched the edge of the bier. That is how my father sounded. Lydia took Viola's brass key from her pocket. It was long, narrow, and toothed on both sides. It did not fit the coffin lock. She moved toward the wet outline and saw, beneath the moisture shaped like a handle, a small keyhole emerging in the limestone. The key entered. The wall opened inward without dust or broken mortar. Beyond it lay darkness. The hurricane lantern flame bent toward the opening. The hidden room was no larger than a railway compartment. 5 stone shelves lined one wall. On each shelf rested a shallow wooden tray stained nearly black. A narrow grill looked into the main receiving house from behind the canopy. Hooks protruded from the ceiling. Against the rear wall stood a wooden chair with leather straps. The air carried a pressure that made Lydia's teeth ache. On the floor lay thousands of black cloth tokens. Ruth lifted the lantern. A coffin occupied the lowest shelf. It was not Viola's. It was narrow, covered in gray dust, and bound with 3 iron bands. The lid bore no name, only a small square window of cloudy glass. Something moved beneath the glass. Benjamin screamed. A pale palm pressed upward from inside the coffin, flattened against the pane, and slowly curled into a fist. Noah raised the crowbar. "Do not," Calvin said. The fist knocked once. Every chair in the receiving house toppled backward. Outside, the circling footsteps stopped. A voice came through the cloudy pane. "Who remained?" The 7 living stood in silence. The voice repeated the question. "Who remained?" Reverend Pike whispered. "We did." The iron bands snapped loose, not violently, one after another, with soft metallic clicks. The coffin lid lifted half an inch. Black cloth spilled from the gap, not a few tokens, but a continuous ribbon of them, sliding onto the floor and spreading like a nest of insects. Each carried a stitched initial. Lydia saw hundreds of letters, some bright, some faded to brown. Noah forced the lid shut. The cloth stopped. "What is in there?" Julian asked. Ruth looked at the old plan. Adelaide Voss was buried the next morning. Then that is not her coffin. No. Benjamin leaned against the wall, shaking. It is the witness box. Noah turned on him. Benjamin swallowed. My father said the trustees made Inez lie down in an empty coffin. They told the remaining mourners that if they did not sign, they would hear her buried alive too. She stayed in the coffin until dawn, while Adelaide died behind the wall. Lydia stared at the pale hand, still visible through the glass. Inez survived? She was gone when they opened the building. The coffin was empty. Where did she go? No one knew. The voice beneath the glass spoke again. Who remained? This time the question came from every black token on the floor. Julian pressed his hands over his ears. Reverend Pike began the Lord's Prayer. At "Thy kingdom come," his voice was joined by dozens of others, all speaking one word behind him. When he said "daily bread," they said "bread" after he had finished. When he reached "deliver us," the delayed voices changed the phrase. "Deliver us," he said. "Count us," they answered. He stopped praying. In the main room, Viola's coffin began to move. It slid off the bier without tipping and came to rest in front of the hidden doorway. The walnut lid faced the old witness box. The two coffins lay head to head like adversaries. Midnight was still 4 hours away. Noah checked his wristwatch. The second hand was moving, but the minute hand had stopped at 8:11. Ruth's watch showed the same. The wall clock above the doors read 8:11. Lydia understood that the wake would not progress by ordinary time. "It is waiting for everyone," she said. Calvin shook his head. Everyone left. No, they were driven out. A pounding began at the outer doors. Edwin Marr's voice shouted from the rain. "Let us in!" Clara Marr joined him, then others. The hardware merchant, the sisters from Dubuque, the nurse. One by one, the 43 invited mourners called from outside. Ruth reached for the door latch. Calvin grabbed her. "Listen." The voices continued. None of them took a breath. They repeated their requests in perfect intervals, each sentence identical in rhythm. "Let us in! Let us in! Let us in!" Noah looked through the narrow window. "What do you see?" Lydia asked. He stepped back. "No people." The pounding stopped. A single fingernail scratched the glass from the outside, drawing a vertical line through the rain. Then another line. Then another. 43 marks appeared. Benjamin sat down on the floor. Viola knew what would happen. Lydia faced him. She knew what had happened. That is different. She arranged this. She arranged for witnesses. To what? The walnut coffin answered with a heavy blow from inside. Noah said, "To an opening." He took up the pocket knife again and dug at the black wax in the second lock. Calvin drew a small revolver from inside his coat. Everyone stared at him. "This coffin remains closed until midnight." Noah did not stop. "Put that away. The rule was written for a reason." The rule protected the people who killed Adelaide Voss. The rule may also keep whatever is in that room from entering ours. Lydia stepped between them. Viola said the coffin must remain shut until midnight. We will obey that. But we need midnight to arrive. Julian looked at the frozen clocks. How? The hidden coffin whispered. By attendance. The black tokens began creeping across the floor. They moved toward the main room in thin lines, passing between shoes and chair legs. Each token climbed an abandoned chair and settled on the seat. As they did, invisible weight returned. The chairs filled again, but now the impressions wore the shapes of the people who had fled that night. Lydia saw Edwin's stooped shoulders, Clara's hat brim, Paul Dre's large hands gripping his knees. The wake was counting them present without their bodies. The clock advanced 1 minute, 8:12. A cold certainty came over Lydia. The room wants 43 mourners, she said. It does not care whether they are living. Ruth looked at the occupied chairs. Then why did it drive them out? Benjamin answered from the floor. Because that is what happened before. The receiving house was repeating the old wake, but imperfectly. The same number invited, the same number expelled, the same 2 coffins facing one another. Yet this time, 7 people remained by choice. The original crime was not only that Adelaide had been left to die, it was that witnesses had allowed themselves to be divided into the brave, the frightened, the bribed, and the silent. The room was rebuilding those categories. Lydia remembered Viola's manner during her last week. She had asked unusual questions. Would Lydia stay beside a dying person who no longer recognized her? Would she forgive someone who confessed too late? Was witnessing an act of courage, if no one believed the witness? At the time, Lydia had blamed fever. Now she knew Viola had been preparing her. The clock continued advancing as tokens filled chairs. 8:13, 8:14. At 8:20, the electric lamps returned, but their light had changed. The receiving house appeared older. The folding chairs became cane-bottomed. The coffee urn vanished, replaced by enamel pitchers. The mourners' coats on hooks became shawls and heavy wool overcoats. Through the windows, there was no rain, only blackness. Ruth opened the cemetery plan again. New writing had appeared across it in violet ink. 5 were breathing. Noah read it twice. 5? Calvin said. Adelaide was one. Ephraim was another. Who were the other 3? No one knew. The hidden coffin knocked 3 times. From the 5 stone shelves came the sound of breathing. 1 breath from the first. 1 from the second. 1 from the third. The 4th shelf remained silent. The 5th produced a baby's thin, whistling inhale. Benjamin covered his face. Lydia looked at him. Your father told you more. He told Viola, not me. You were invited because you know something. I was invited because she hated me. Viola did not waste hatred. His hands dropped. She found letters, he said, in my father's desk after he died, written by Inez Worrow. He had kept them hidden. Where are they? Benjamin looked toward Viola's coffin. She had them buried with her. Noah closed his eyes briefly. Then we wait until midnight. The room replied by latching the outer doors. The metal bolt slid into place without touch. Rain returned against the windows. The year 1911 faded, then returned in flashes. Each flash showed different people seated in the chairs. In one, Lydia saw a young Viola March, 13 years old, holding the hand of her coughing brother. In another, the chairs were empty except for black tokens. In another, 43 mourners faced the sealed wall, while a man in a white coat walked among them distributing papers. Reverend Pike recognized him from an old parish photograph. Dr. Silas Gant, the cemetery physician. Calvin's grandfather had been treasurer. Ruth's grandfather had bricked the door. Viola's father had served on the board. Benjamin's father had survived because Inez defied the fee. The old wake had tied families together through rescue and abandonment alike. Lydia alone had no inherited place. Perhaps that was why Viola had chosen her. At 9:15, the first living person tried to leave. Julian Vale had been silent for nearly an hour, studying Viola's will by lantern light. Without warning, he folded the pages, put them in his coat, and walked to the outer doors. I have fulfilled my professional duty. The latch would not move. He pulled harder. Behind him, one of the invisible mourners stood. The chair rose from the floor, held by unseen hands. It turned toward Julian. A black token dropped onto his shoulder. He brushed it away. The token clung. Julian staggered. His face tightened, as if he had heard news from a great distance. "What is it?" Lydia asked. He whispered, "My mother." No one in the room spoke. "She's asking why I left her at the hospital." Noah approached slowly. "Your mother died years ago." "I was 17. I told the nurse I would stay. Then I went to a picture show." The invisible chair moved closer. Julian backed against the doors. I returned before morning. The token crawled from his shoulder to his throat. He began clawing at it. Lydia caught his wrists. "It is not accusing you of her death. It is measuring whether you stayed." "I was a boy." "Then say why you left." "I was afraid." The token stopped moving. Julian sobbed once. "I was afraid to watch her stop breathing." The cloth loosened and fell. The invisible chair returned to its place. The clock advanced to 9:16. The room did not demand innocence. It demanded truth about departure. One by one, the 7 understood that each attempt to leave would call up an abandonment from their own lives. Reverend Pike confessed that he had left a parishioner alone after a suicide attempt because the man smelled of liquor, and the rector felt disgust rather than compassion. Ruth confessed that she had ignored a groundskeeper's warnings about a sinking grave until the man was injured. Noah admitted he had abandoned his younger brother in a burning garage. He had gone for help and returned too late. The scar on his hand came from the door, not from trying to reach him as he had told people. Benjamin refused to speak. Calvin kept the revolver in his hand. Lydia felt no token touch her. The room seemed to be waiting for another confession from her, one she did not yet know she possessed. At 10 o'clock, by the frozen clock, the walnut coffin began to leak. Water seeped from beneath the lid and ran down the sides in clear sheets. It did not pool on the floor. It rose in narrow columns, shaping itself into 5 upright forms around the bier. The first was a boy. The second was a young woman with flattened hair. The third was a bearded man in a work shirt. The fourth was an infant, held by no visible arms. The fifth was only the outline of a person beneath a sheet. All 5 breathed. Noah whispered they were declared dead while alive. The boy turned his water-clear face toward Benjamin. The young woman turned toward Calvin. The bearded man faced Ruth. The infant faced Reverend Pike. The shrouded figure faced Lydia. No apparition faced Noah or Julian. Each of the 5 was linked, not merely to a family, but to an office. The March family, the cemetery board, the keeper of the grounds, the clergy, and the witness without lineage. The water figures opened their mouths. Air entered them from the room. The living felt pressure in their lungs, a pull like altitude. Lydia gasped. Reverend Pike dropped to one knee. Ruth clutched the table. The figures were borrowing breath. The child inside Viola's coffin coughed again. Noah shouted, "They are taking enough air to speak." The boy's watery throat moved. "Ephraim," the young woman said. "Adelaide." The bearded man said, "Jonas Pell." The infant produced no name, only a small choking sound. The covered figure whispered, "Inez." The water collapsed. Everyone breathed at once. On the old plan, 3 more names appeared. Jonas Pell. Infant female, unrecorded. Inez Worrow. Lydia stared at the final name. Inez had been one of the 5 breathing people. She was not only the witness, Lydia said. They declared her dead too. Ruth entered the hidden room and examined the leather-strapped chair. Beneath it, scratched into the floor, were words worn nearly smooth. "They will believe a coffin before a woman." Ruth read them aloud. The hidden coffin shuddered. Benjamin crawled backward. "No," he said. "Don't open it." Lydia looked at him. "What did Inez write in the letters?" "She said she escaped." "How?" "She did not say." "What did your father know?" Benjamin struck the floor with his fist. "He knew she came to our house 3 nights after the wake. He knew my grandfather hid her in the attic." "Why?" "Because the trustees were looking for her." Calvin raised the revolver. "Your family sheltered her." "For 2 days." "Then what?" Benjamin's face twisted. "My grandfather turned her in." The hidden coffin slammed upward against its lid. The iron bands flew across the room. One struck the stone and bent. Another shattered the viewing grill. The third wrapped around Calvin's gun hand and pulled his arm down. The coffin lid opened to the width of a finger. Cold air poured out. Benjamin shouted over the noise. "He traded her for Ephraim's medical debt. The board promised the boy would keep receiving treatment." Lydia grabbed the lid with Noah and forced it downward. "What did they do to Inez?" Benjamin's answer came as a whisper. "They held a funeral for her." The room became still. "A public funeral?" Julian asked. "No. A wake, here. Only trustees and selected witnesses. They said she had died of fever. They put her in the witness coffin alive and made people sit until she stopped moving. Then they sealed the coffin inside the back room." Ruth looked at the coffin beneath their hands. "You said it was empty when they opened it." "That was the story my father told himself. Viola found the letters and learned the truth. Inez wrote them before they took her. The final one said she expected to be buried without a name." The hidden coffin breathed beneath their palms. Lydia understood the black tokens. Inez had been forced to witness whether others breathed. Then the town had forced others to witness her death. Attendance had become the instrument of murder. Viola's wake was forbidden because any gathering in the building risked completing what Inez had begun. Not revenge, but a full accounting of who stayed, who left, who signed, who profited, and who remained alive inside a coffin while respectable people waited for silence. The clock advanced to 10:30. The invisible mourners turned their heads toward Calvin. He pulled against the iron band around his wrist. "My grandfather is dead." The chairs creaked. "My father is dead." The black tokens lifted from the seats and circled him like ash. "I did not kill her." One token settled over his heart. Calvin's mouth opened, but the voice that emerged belonged to an old man. "We certified cessation at 11:40. Another voice came through him. "We heard movement until 12:17. A third. "We recorded death before midnight to avoid a second date." Calvin dropped the revolver. His body jerked with each sentence. The body was transferred without inspection. The coffin was sealed with municipal authority. The witnesses were compensated from cemetery funds. We prohibited vigils to prevent recurrence. His own voice returned in a scream. The iron band released him. He fell beside the bier. Julian picked up the revolver and emptied the cartridges onto the floor. "What recurrence?" Lydia asked. Calvin wept without covering his face. "The dead refusing the time, written for them. At 11, the outer walls began to sweat. Moisture ran down the limestone and gathered in words, not names. Times. 7:14, 8:03, 9:26, 10:51, 12:17. Hundreds of times appeared, each the moment someone inside the building had last been heard moving after official death had been declared. Some were separated from their recorded times by minutes, others by hours, one by 2 days. Old Sentinel Cemetery had not suffered one error. It had built a practice around uncertainty and then priced the right to question it. The second examination fee had turned breath into privilege. Inez had threatened more than individual reputations. She had threatened the income of the cemetery, the physician, the undertakers, and the board. The forbidden wake was not a superstition born from one haunting. It was an administrative seal over years of premature burials. Noah read the Times with the concentration of a man examining his own profession. "How many?" he asked. Ruth counted rows until she stopped. More than 200. Reverend Pike sank into a chair. The infant's choking sound returned from the stone shelf. On the wall beneath 1051, a small handprint appeared. The rector removed his collar. "My predecessor baptized an unnamed infant after death," he said. "There is a note in the church register. No mother listed. No burial plot." The handprint darkened. "What was written?" Lydia asked. "Female child. Found deceased." She was alive. He closed his eyes. Perhaps. The room filled with the smell of warm milk. From the hooks in the hidden room, invisible cradles began to sway. At 11:15, the black tokens abandoned the chairs and moved toward Viola's coffin. They climbed the bier legs and arranged themselves across the lid in lines. Words formed. "Open at midnight. Count the breathing. Do not pray over movement." Lydia looked at the clock. 45 minutes remained, but time no longer moved unless the room accepted a truth. The hand stayed at 11:15. "We have not finished," she said. Benjamin laughed bitterly. "Finished what?" "The reasons we leave." The others had confessed. Benjamin had admitted his family's betrayal. Calvin had spoken the board's record through possession. Yet the clock remained still. The room wanted Lydia. She walked among the abandoned chairs. What had she left? Her mother had died when Lydia was 19, but Lydia had stayed through the final night. Her father had disappeared years earlier, and she had searched until money ran out. She had no husband, no child, no sibling. She had made a life from not being needed enough to fail anyone. Then she remembered Viola's last morning. The old woman had awakened confused and called Lydia by another name. She had begged her not to let the men take the coffin. Lydia, exhausted after 3 nights without sleep, had told the nurse Viola was delirious and gone home. Viola died 40 minutes later. Lydia had not been present. She had told herself the nurse was there. She had told herself Viola no longer knew her. She had told herself departure was sensible. A black token rose from the floor. It bore the letter L. "I left Viola," Lydia said. The token waited. "She asked me to stay, and I decided her fear was only illness." The token touched her palm. "I was tired. I resented that she needed me. I wanted one night in which no one dying could call my name." The cloth became warm. "I loved her, and I left anyway." The token dissolved into black threads. The clock advanced to 11:16. Then, minute by minute, it began moving on its own. Outside, the false voices of the departed mourners resumed. This time, they did not ask to enter. They begged to be released. The windows clouded with faces. Edwin Marr appeared, eyes wide, mouth shaping words that no sound carried. Clara stood behind him. Paul Dre pressed both hands to the glass. All 43 living mourners were somewhere outside the building, trapped not physically, but within the old pattern of expulsion. Their bodies had driven home, but their witnessing selves remained at the cemetery. At 11:30, headlights appeared beyond the gate. Cars returned from town without drivers. They rolled uphill in silence, stopped along the cemetery road, and left their doors open. Radios glowed. One played a baseball recap from Chicago, but the announcer's voice gradually slowed until each word became a breath. At 11:40, every grave in the eastern section released a thin line of vapor. The vapor traveled along the ground toward the receiving house. Ruth opened the outer doors despite the locked bolts. They yielded at her touch now. The cemetery lay under a low white mist. Headstones seemed to float. The vapor entered in streams and gathered above the empty chairs. Each chair acquired a breathing shape, hundreds of them. The receiving house expanded without changing its walls. Rows continued into impossible depth. Mourners from decades sat shoulder to shoulder. Miners, shopkeepers, mothers, children, soldiers, widows in black veils, men with hat bands, girls holding flowers gone brown. Some had stayed through wakes. Some had fled. Some had signed statements. Some had listened to movement and convinced themselves it was settling wood. All looked toward the two coffins. The clock reached 11:50. Noah prepared his tools: a screwdriver, a coffin key, a small hammer. He wiped his hands on a cloth. "When we open Viola," he said, "we may not find Viola." Lydia nodded. "When we open the other, we may find someone who has been dying for 58 years. Ruth brought a shovel into the hidden room and wedged it beneath the old coffin lid. Reverend Pike stood without his collar and without a prayer book. Julian held Viola's letters of instruction. Benjamin knelt at the head of the witness coffin. Calvin sat against the wall, stripped of office by terror. At 11:55, 5 breaths sounded from beneath the stone shelves. At 11:56, the outer doors closed. At 11:57, every invisible mourner stood. At 11:58, Viola's coffin locks turned by themselves. At 11:59, the black wax lifted from the keyholes and formed a small human mouth on the lid. The mouth said, "No one leaves while breath remains." Midnight arrived. No bell announced it. No church clock reached the room. The wall clock simply placed both hands together, and every coffin in Old Sentinel Cemetery knocked once beneath the earth. Noah opened Viola's coffin. The body inside wore Viola's black dress, Viola's lace collar, Viola's silver hair. Her hands were folded over her chest. Her face was peaceful. On top of her lay a bundle of letters tied with red thread. Her eyes opened. Lydia could not move. Viola did not breathe. Her chest remained still, yet her gaze found Lydia with full intelligence. "Read," she said. The word came not from her mouth, but from the room. Lydia took the letters. Noah checked the body with trembling fingers. No pulse. Viola's eyes shifted toward the witness coffin. Ruth and Benjamin lifted its lid. Inside lay a woman in a gray dress. She had not decayed. Her skin was the color of wax kept in cold storage. Her hair, once dark, had turned white at the temples. The nails of both hands were broken to the quick. A black cloth token rested on each eyelid. Her chest rose. A shallow breath entered, then another. Inez Worrow had been breathing inside the forbidden wake for 58 years. Benjamin fell forward, sobbing. "I'm sorry." Inez's eyes remained covered. The room spoke through Viola. "Do not apologize where testimony is required." Lydia untied the letters. The first was addressed to Ephraim March. It described finding him alive in his coffin. It told him that survival was not a debt owed to the board, the physician, or the family that later betrayed her. It asked him, when old enough, to speak publicly. He never had. The second letter named Jonas Pell, a laborer declared dead after a mine accident. Inez had heard him breathe, but the physician ordered burial because opening the coffin would expose that his company doctor had administered too much laudanum. The third described Adelaide Voss, alive after childbirth, abandoned because her husband could not pay. The fourth concerned the unnamed infant, born to a hotel maid and hidden by a prominent father. The child had been sedated to prevent crying and declared dead when the mother demanded her return. The fifth letter was addressed to Viola. You saw them close me in. You were a child, and children are not responsible for the rooms adults build around them. But if you live long enough to become one of the adults, then you are responsible for which doors remain closed. Lydia's voice faltered. Viola's open eyes did not blink. The letter continued. The wake will not end by opening my coffin. It will end only when those driven out are invited back by the truth, and when the breathing are counted before the dead. On the underside of the final page was a list of instructions. Each of the 5 must be named as living at the moment they were denied. Each institution that profited must relinquish its authority inside the room. No prayer for the dead may be spoken until every breath has been heard. The 43 mourners must cross the threshold willingly, not under compulsion. One witness without inherited guilt must decide whether Inez is living or dead. Lydia looked at Inez. The woman's chest barely moved. How do we bring the mourners back? Ruth asked. Viola's body raised one finger and pointed toward the outer doors. They opened. Beyond them stood the 43 invited mourners in the rain. Not apparitions. Their living bodies had returned. Some wore nightclothes beneath coats. Some had driven back without remembering the journey. Edwin Marr had blood on his palms from climbing the gate. Clara held both their hats. Paul Dre's Buick idled behind him with the passenger door still open. None would cross the threshold. Lydia carried the letters outside. Rain struck the pages, but did not wet them. She faced the crowd. You were invited because Viola believed each of you had inherited a piece of this story, or benefited from forgetting it. You were driven out because fear is part of what this building remembers. You can leave again. But if you do, the wake will keep your place occupied. Edwin Marr stared past her into the receiving house. I heard my coffin close. Clara said, I saw a door where they took my grandmother. Paul Dre whispered, my family supplied the iron bands. Others began speaking. A pharmacist's grandson admitted his shop still possessed the old physician's ledgers. A banker's widow knew of an account funded by cemetery examination fees. A retired nurse had found death, certificates with altered hours. The 2 sisters from Dubuque were descendants of Adelaide Voss's younger brother. Each had been selected by Viola, not merely as a mourner, but as a living continuation of the old wake. Lydia held out the first letter. Ephraim March was alive. Benjamin stood inside the doorway and repeated it. Ephraim March was alive. The boy-shaped water figure formed beside Viola's coffin. One mourner crossed the threshold. Lydia read the second. Jonas Pell was alive. Ruth removed her cemetery keys and placed them on the floor. Old Sentinel had no authority to call him dead. The bearded water figure appeared. 5 more mourners entered. Adelaide Voss was alive. Calvin Sloan removed his mayoral pin. The city used its authority to silence her. The young woman formed in water. 12 more crossed. The unnamed infant was alive. Reverend Pike laid his collar on the mayor's pin. The church accepted a death because a living child would have exposed a man. The invisible cradle began to sway. More mourners entered. Finally, Lydia turned toward the hidden room. Inez Worrow was alive. Noah stood beside the open witness coffin. She is alive. The room recoiled. Every invisible mourner inhaled. The sound was enormous, a storm drawn through human lungs. The walls bowed outward. The roof beams groaned. Rain blew horizontally through the open doors. Inez's chest rose higher. The tokens fell from her eyes. They opened. Her irises were pale gray. She looked not at Lydia, but at Viola. Viola's dead face softened. For one moment, the old teacher appeared 13 again, frightened and resolute beside her brother's coffin. Inez spoke with her own voice. "You took long enough." Viola smiled. Then her eyes closed, and her body became only a body. The wake erupted. The hundreds of invisible mourners began moving toward the doors, but they did not leave peacefully. They surged through the room in panic, repeating the original expulsion. Chairs flew, coats tore from hooks. The living 43 were driven backward by bodies they could not see. Lydia understood the final cruelty. The room had remembered being forced out so completely that even truth could not teach it another ending. "We need to stop the leaving," she shouted. Noah tried to shut the doors, but the crowd of spirits held them open. Ruth planted herself in the threshold. Wind and unseen shoulders struck her, yet she remained. The living mourners linked arms. Edwin and Clara stood beside Ruth. Paul Dre joined them. One after another, all 43 formed a human barrier across the entrance. The dead pressed forward. The receiving house filled with cries from every wake it had contained. Pleading, denial, bargaining. The practiced calm of physicians, the clipped authority of trustees, the prayers of clergy who had mistaken stillness for certainty. Beneath all of it, faint but persistent, came the scratching of those not yet dead. Lydia went to Inez. The woman sat up with terrible slowness. Her joints made no sound. Her gray dress remained unrotted, but the cloth beneath her was black with decades of tokens. "You must tell them to stay," Lydia said. Inez looked at the human chain in the doorway. "They stayed once. They were punished for it. Yes, they need a different reason." Inez turned toward the endless rows of invisible mourners. "No," she said. "They need permission to leave without abandoning anyone." Lydia saw the distinction. The curse had bound, staying to virtue and leaving to betrayal. But no wake could last forever. The dead required release, and the living required the right to go after the truth had been witnessed. The original trustees had corrupted both acts. They drove people out before testimony, then imprisoned those who remained. The room knew no honest departure. "How?" Lydia asked. Inez pointed to the black tokens. "Return attendance." Lydia gathered handfuls and gave them to the mourners. The cloth was cold and damp. 43 living people received 43 tokens. "Speak your own name," Lydia told them. "Say what you witnessed, then place the token inside the witness coffin and leave by choice." Edwin Marr went first. "My name is Edwin Marr. I witnessed that Ephraim March was alive when Inez Worrow opened his coffin. I witnessed that fear made me run tonight. I returned." He placed his token beside Inez. Then he walked through the doorway. No force stopped him. Clara followed. "My name is Clara Marr. I witnessed that this building had a hidden room, and that my family taught me to forget it. I returned." She left. One by one, the mourners spoke. Some testified to the 5 breathing people. Some admitted family prophets. Some confessed they knew only fragments, but had chosen comfort over inquiry. Each placed a token in the coffin and crossed the threshold. As they left, an invisible mourner stood from the endless rows and walked beside them into the rain. Living and dead departed together, not in panic, but in pairs. The receiving house began shrinking to its true size. At 23 mourners, the farthest rows disappeared. At 12, the cane chairs became folding chairs again. At 5, the electric floor lamps brightened. At 1, only Lydia, Noah, Ruth, Julian, Reverend Pike, Calvin, Benjamin, and Inez remained. Benjamin held the final token. He knelt before Inez. "My name is Benjamin March. I witnessed that my family's rescue was purchased with your betrayal. I witnessed that I used shame as an excuse to do nothing after I learned. I returned." He placed the token in her palm. Inez closed her fingers around it. "Your father was 8 when I saved him," she said. "He was a man when he surrendered me." Benjamin wept. "Do not confuse the two," she said. He left. The 43 invited mourners had gone freely. Yet the old wake did not end. The 5 water figures remained around Viola's coffin. Inez still breathed. The walls still bore hundreds of false death times. Lydia read the final instruction again. One witness without inherited guilt must decide whether Inez is living or dead. Noah said, "She's breathing. There is nothing to decide." Inez looked at Lydia. "Breathing is not the only life they took." Lydia understood that Inez could not step into 1969 as if 58 years had not passed. Everyone she knew was dead. Her name had become rumor. Her body had been preserved by the very wake that imprisoned her. To call her living might condemn her to continue. To call her dead might repeat the board's crime. The decision was not medical. It was consent. "What do you want?" Lydia asked. No one had asked Inez that in 58 years. The woman looked around the receiving house, at the opened coffin, at Viola's body, at the wet times on the walls, at the doorway through which every mourner had departed. "I want to leave before they pray," she said. Reverend Pike bowed his head. Lydia offered her hand. Inez stepped from the coffin. The instant her feet touched the floor, the 5 water figures turned toward her. The child, the woman, the laborer, the infant, and the shrouded witness raised their hands. Inez walked between them. At the outer doors, she paused. The cemetery beyond was no longer raining. A pale pre-dawn light lay over the stones, though every watch in the room still showed midnight. "Am I alive?" she asked Lydia. "You are leaving by your own will," Lydia said. "That is the life they denied you." Inez nodded. She crossed the threshold. Her body did not collapse or vanish. She walked down the cemetery path with measured steps. The 5 water figures followed, losing shape as they moved through the grass. At the eastern wall, the first light touched them. Ephraim became a boy, running. Adelaide lifted an unseen child. Jonah straightened from years of pain. The infant became a brief, warm brightness in Inez's arms. The shrouded figure fell away from Inez like an empty sheet. Then all 5 were gone. Inez continued alone to the gate. Lydia followed as far as the path. At the gate, Inez looked back once. She was very old now. Her preserved face had altered during the walk, taking on every year withheld from it. Lines deepened. Her hair whitened completely. Her shoulders bent. But she remained standing. She stepped onto Gear Street. Morning traffic moved below the hill. A milk truck turned a corner. A radio played from an open bakery door. Galena had entered another ordinary day. Inez walked toward town and disappeared behind a row of monuments. No one found her afterward. Some believed she reached the river. Others said she boarded an early bus. Ruth searched every path and building in the cemetery. Noah checked the hospitals. Lydia walked the streets until noon. They found only the black token with the letter I resting on the far side of the gate. Back inside the receiving house, Viola's coffin was closed. The walls were dry. The hidden room remained open but empty. The witness coffin had collapsed inward into soft gray dust. Among it lay a pair of iron hinges, several broken nails, and a strip of leather cut cleanly through. At 8 that morning, the cemetery board convened an emergency session. By 10, Calvin Sloan had resigned as mayor. By noon, The old ledgers were removed from private storage and delivered to the county courthouse. Over the following months, death records were reviewed, burial dates corrected, and 27 families petitioned to open graves. Not every grave revealed a horror. Some held ordinary dead, some did not. 3 coffins bore deep scratches inside their lids. One contained a woman buried on her side, with both hands pressed against the wood. Another was empty, except for a black cloth token. The scandal spread beyond Galena. Newspapers called it the Sentinel Inquiry. Lawyers argued over statutes, responsibility, and whether the dead could be wronged after every responsible official had died. The cemetery closed its eastern section for a year. The receiving house was never demolished. Ruth refused. She removed the hidden wall entirely and left the back room visible from the main chamber. The leather chair was burned. The black tokens were placed in glass cases with the names of those who could be identified. A plaque listed the 5 known breathing people, including the unnamed infant. Reverend Pike never again used the phrase "at rest" unless a physician and a family member had both confirmed death. Noah became head undertaker at Harker's and instituted a waiting period that other funeral homes mocked until the state adopted stricter procedures years later. Benjamin March donated his father's letters to the library, then left Galena. He wrote Lydia once a year. None of the letters asked forgiveness. Calvin Sloan testified publicly and spent the remainder of his life cataloging municipal records. He never held office again. Lydia inherited Viola's brick house and no money. The larger estate passed to the hospital and library as promised. In a desk drawer, she found a final envelope with no message, only a black token stitched with her initial. She kept it in a jar beside the window. For many years, people in Galena argued over what had happened at the forbidden wake. Some said panic and carbon monoxide had caused hallucinations. Others blamed contaminated coffee, old grief, or a coordinated performance arranged by Viola before her death. Edwin Marr refused every interview. Clara would only say that certain rooms remained in a town even after their doors were sealed. The 43 mourners never met as a group again. Yet each October 17th, before midnight, they returned separately to Old Sentinel Cemetery. They entered the receiving house, sat for 1 minute, spoke their names, and left. They brought no flowers. They said no prayers. They never shut the doors. By 1988, only 19 remained alive. By 1999, 7. Lydia was the last. On the 30th anniversary, she climbed the hill alone. The cemetery had changed. New bronze markers stood among the limestone. The road was paved. The city lights below had multiplied. But the receiving house smelled the same. Mineral damp, old wood, and faint face powder. Lydia placed her token on the empty bier. "My name is Lydia Keene," she said. "I witnessed that Inez Wurrow was alive. I witnessed that Viola March arranged a wake so the truth could leave by the front door." The room was silent. She turned to go. Behind her, one folding chair creaked under invisible weight. Lydia stopped. A woman's voice, very old and very near, said, "You may leave now." Lydia crossed the threshold. The doors remained open behind her. As she walked down the wet path, every headstone in the eastern section released a single white breath. The breaths rose together above the cemetery, not as figures, not as faces, but as a pale cloud that drifted over Galena and dissolved before it reached the river. In the receiving house, Lydia's black token lay on the bier until dawn. Then the stitched letter came loose. The thread curled across the wood in the shape of a doorway, and from the hidden room came one soft knock, not asking to be opened, but answering that no one remained inside.